Lecture 31, The Dialectic Between the Environment and Behavior. Now let's turn to the next of our three dialectics in social behavior, the dialectic between the environment and behavior, and focus on the effects of the environment, physical and social, on the individual's behavior in that environment. We're going to focus mostly on social features in the environment. And remember, we're defining behavior in terms of the person's overt behavior, overt action that's publicly visible. The effects of the environment on behavior have been a major topic for experimental social psychology, especially given that social psychology has traditionally been defined as the psychology of social influence. This emphasis goes back at least as far as the work of Floyd Allport, who wrote an early text on social psychology, in which he defined social behavior as behavior that occurs in response to the stimulus of another person's behavior, or as behavior that serves as a stimulus to another person's response. You can see here how Allport was couching his definition of social psychology in terms of the stimulus-response framework that was dominant in psychology at the time, and you can also see the beginnings of the affinity between experimental social psychology and behaviorism in general. 30 years later, Floyd Allport's younger brother, Gordon Allport, mostly known as a personality psychologist, offered a definition of social psychology strictly in terms of social influence. From Gordon Allport's point of view, social psychology studied how the thought, feeling, and behavior of individuals was influenced by the presence of other human beings, a presence either actual or imagined or implied. In these lectures, we're going to focus on social influences on behavior. In the dialectic between the environment and behavior, features of the environment, especially the social environment, elicit behavior from the individual regardless of his or her internal states and dispositions, traits, and attitudes. This direction of causality is expressed well in the doctrine of situationism, and is exemplified by a large body of social psychological research documenting social influences on behavior. In each of these cases, the individual's behavior is influenced by the environmental situation in which that behavior occurs. The classic study of social influence, perhaps one of the most famous social psychological experiments of all time, is work by Solomon Asch on the subject of conformity. In Asch's experiment, subjects were recruited for an experiment on perception. And in this experiment, they were asked to indicate which of three comparison lines matched a standard line in length. Of course, this is a fairly straightforward perceptual task, and subjects make few errors on it, though, of course, the matching is more difficult on some trials than on others. In Asch's experiment, subjects were run either individually, one at a time, or in groups. But in fact, even when the experiment was run in groups, there was actually only one real subject. All the other subjects were confederates of the experimenter who were acting in accordance with a prearranged script. The purpose of the experiment was to see how the behavior of these confederates would influence the behavior of that one subject. In one version of the Asch experiment, all the subjects, including the confederates, announced their judgments publicly. And on critical trials, the situation was arranged so that the one real subject went last. On some trials, the confederates were instructed to agree on the correct response. On other trials, they were instructed to agree on an incorrect response. So on all trials, the confederates agreed among themselves, but on some trials, they were unanimous in agreeing on the wrong choice. And the question is how their behavior would affect the choice made by the subject, the real subject, who always went last. This graph shows the results of the experiment in terms of the percentage of real subjects who conformed to the objectively erroneous judgments of the others in the group, the confederates. The first point to be made is that when subjects were run alone, when the size of the unanimous group was 0, they never made a mistake, even on the most difficult of the trials. And when the subjects were run with only one or two confederates present, they were largely unaffected by the behavior of the Confederates, though you can see there was an increase in conformity when there were 2 Confederates as opposed to only 1. But once the group consisted of 3 or more Confederates, and Ash ran groups with as many as 15 Confederates, the subjects began to conform to the erroneous judgments of the group on about 1/3 of the trials. They didn't always conform, but they did conform about 1/3 of the time. So here we have our first effect of the social environment on the behavior of the individual. The number of people in the unanimous group affects whether the subject is going to conform to their judgment or not. Now, in the experiment I just told you about, the Confederates were unanimous in their judgments. But in a follow-up study, Ash arranged the procedure such that the Confederates were unanimous in their erroneous judgments on some trials, but on others, one single Confederate, just one, dissented from the erroneous judgment of the majority. So Ash was interested in how this new feature of the social situation, the presence or absence of just a single dissenter from the group, would affect the subject's behavior. And here are the results of that experiment. Remember, we've got a single subject in the presence of a group of 7 experimental Confederates. On some trials, these Confederates are unanimous in making the wrong choice. On other trials, there's just a single dissenter. And again, when the Confederates were unanimous, the subject conformed his choices to theirs on about 1/3 of the trials, a little over 30%. That's the same rate we saw in the previous experiment. But when there was just a single dissenter, conformity dropped from about 32% of trials to only about 6% of trials. So the size of the group made a difference to conformity in the earlier experiment. The presence of a dissenter, another feature of the social situation, made a difference to conformity in this experiment. The individual shows a tendency to conform his behavior to group norms, but the degree of conformity depends on whether the others are unanimous. Now, in Ash's experiments, the subjects were always a minority of 1 against a majority of Confederates. In the last experiment, there were 7 Confederates. In a variant on Ash's experiment, Charlene Nemeth and her colleagues, working at UC Berkeley, looked at the effects of minority influence on the individual's behavior, not majority influence. Nemeth also used a perceptual task. This time, the subjects were asked to make a judgment about the color of a stimulus, whether it was blue or blue-green. Her groups consisted of 6 naive subjects, that is, 6 real subjects, whereas Ash had only 1 per group, and from 1 to 4 Confederates, though, again, the Confederates this time are in the minority, not in the majority. The way the stimuli were constructed, they were usually blue, and that's what the naive subjects typically said. But on some trials, the Confederates, acting in accordance with the experimenter's script, wrongly judged the color patch to be blue-green. And what Nemeth wanted to determine were the circumstances under which a minority would influence the judgment of individuals who were actually in the majority. Under what circumstances would the naive subjects adopt the erroneous judgment of the minority? And here are the results of the study. When the subjects were run alone, the naive subjects alone, no Confederates, they almost never made a mistake in judgment. When they called the patch blue, they were almost always right. However, as the minority grew in size, the real subjects showed a tendency to adopt the judgments of this minority. As long as the Confederates constituted a critical mass of 3 or 4, the subjects showed a tendency to conform to their judgments. When there were just 1 or 2 Confederates in the minority, there was very little influence on the subjects' judgments. So especially when other people constitute a majority, but even when they constitute a minority, there is a tendency for us to take our cues from other people and to conform our behavior to what they're doing. That's what social influence is all about. And, as I said at the outset, there are a lot of such studies in the literature of experimental social psychology, which, until recently, was almost exclusively devoted to the study of social influence effects like these. So, for example, as early as 1920, Floyd Allport, following up on an earlier study by Triplett, documented a social facilitation effect on behavior. People performed better under circumstances of competition, or just in the mere presence of other people, than they did when they were alone. Sometime later, Robert Zients found the opposite, a social inhibition effect, where people performed worse in the presence of others than they did alone. So which is it? Social facilitation or social inhibition? Well, it turns out that it depends on the task. When the task is relatively simple, we tend to see social facilitation. When the task is relatively difficult, we tend to see social inhibition. And of course, it's not just a matter of the task, but how it's performed. If the task is something that can be performed rather automatically, we see social facilitation. If the task involves a lot of cognitive effort, we tend to see social inhibition. And of course, how the task is performed depends on who's performing it. So it turns out that when somebody's an expert at a task, the presence of others tends to facilitate or improve task performance. But when somebody is a novice at a task, the presence of others has a deleterious effect, tends to impair task performance. Social facilitation and social inhibition are called social presence effects, or mere presence effects, because they're effects of merely having an audience for your behavior. But sometimes other people aren't merely the audience. We're actually working with them on some task. And in such circumstances, we'll often observe a phenomenon known as social loafing, which is to say that people, when they're working in groups, tend to work less hard than they do when they work individually. The fact that we're working with other people tends to diminish the amount of effort and energy we put into whatever task we're performing. Here are some demonstrations of the social loafing effect from an early study by Latané and his colleagues. They brought subjects into an acoustic laboratory and asked them to cheer or clap or shout just as loud as they could. Sometimes the subjects were run alone. Others were run in groups of 2, 4, or 6. The subjects made much more noise when they were run alone than they did when they were run as part of groups. If everybody in a group of 6 shouted or clapped or cheered just as loud as they possibly could, they would have made a lot more noise than that. But that's not what happened. Each individual in the group slacked off to some extent, letting other people take the load. The result being that, in a sense, the group is less than the sum of its individuals. Now, in these lectures, we're mostly concerned about the effects of the social environment on the individual's behavior. But there are also studies of the effects of the physical environment. For example, crime statistics tell us that the rate of violent crimes, such as rape and murder, tends to be highest during the summer and lowest during the winter. It's not clear exactly why this is the case, but there seems to be something about high levels of heat and humidity that brings out the worst in the individual. In fact, there's a whole new field of psychology, known as environmental psychology, which is concerned precisely with the effects of the physical environment on the experience, thoughts, and actions of the people in those environments. Whether it's heat or humidity or crowding, the color of the walls in schools and hospitals and prisons, whether people are working or living on the upper or lower floors of skyscrapers, whether they have access to direct or only indirect sunlight. It turns out that these features of the physical environment make a difference to people's thoughts and feelings and desires and behaviors. Whereas traditional social psychology studies the effect of the social environment on behavior, this new field of environmental psychology studies the effect of the physical environment. Returning to the social environment now, it turns out that features of the situation can also affect people's tendency to behave in an aggressive and hostile manner toward each other. One of the most popular situationist theories of aggression has been the frustration-aggression hypothesis, originally proposed by a sociologist, John Dollard, and a psychologist, Neil Miller, in the 1940s. Based largely on their studies of rat behavior, Dollard and Miller argued that aggression is a reflexive response to frustration. where frustration was defined broadly to include any obstacle to goal attainment. In the case of the rats, the obstacle was a physical barrier placed between a hungry rat and food. And what they observed was that when a hungry rat encountered such an obstacle, it would turn on other rats that were nearby. So that frustration turned into aggression. These obstacles are obviously features of the environment. When it comes to people, these obstacles are often found in other people who just get in our way when we're trying to attain some goal. The original frustration-aggression hypothesis was pretty interesting, but research over the ensuing years has led to a revision of the frustration-aggression hypothesis. According to the revised frustration-aggression hypothesis promoted by Leonard Berkowitz and others, the definition of frustration is broadened to include any aversive event that's construed as intentionally harmful. Aggression is no longer considered to be an involuntary reflex, which is how Dollard and Millard thought about it, but rather a voluntary behavior on the part of the individual who is frustrated. The revised theory also argues that the pathway from frustration to aggression is mediated by the individual's emotional state, an emotional state of anger. So again, aggression is no longer a reflexive response to frustration. There has to be anger present as well. And finally, the revised theory argues that in response to frustration, anger is most likely to lead to aggression if the environment itself contains cues to aggressive behavior. Thus, in the revised frustration-aggression hypothesis, the important situational feature is not merely an obstacle on the way to a goal, but rather the presence of environmental cues for aggressive behavior. If somebody accidentally steps on our foot, we don't usually lash out at them, but if they do it deliberately, we want to let them have it. As an example of the kind of situation that Berkowitz had in mind, consider an experiment he conducted with LePage on anger, weapons, and frustration. In this experiment, two subjects were brought together in a room to work together on some problems. One of these was a real subject, but the other was a confederate of the experimenter. At the end of the session, the two subjects were asked to evaluate each other's performance on a problem task, and they were given a rather unusual way of expressing this evaluation. They evaluated each other by giving each other electrical shocks, 1 to 10 electrical shocks. Just 1 shock to denote a really good performance, and 10 shocks to denote really bad performance. It's a little different from giving somebody A through F, or a gold star, or a silver or a bronze star. The confederate went first, and according to prior arrangement, gave some subjects 1 shock, indicating good performance, and others 7 shocks, indicating pretty bad performance. Of course, this feedback was entirely independent of the subject's actual performance, which was, overall, quite good. So the subject who got just 1 shock, denoting good performance, got what he thought he deserved. But the subject who got 7 shocks, denoting pretty bad performance, knew that he was being treated unfairly. The intent of this procedure, of course, was to induce anger in the subjects. Then, when it came time for the subjects to evaluate the confederate, they had an opportunity to retaliate, to aggress against the confederate, and so they did. Subjects in the angered condition delivered more shocks than those in the control condition. I'll show you that result in a moment. But we're not finished with the experiment. The really important variable in this experiment was the presence of cues for aggression. As amazing as it is to think about it, in some conditions, the laboratory room was outfitted with a number of actual guns, a revolver, a shotgun, and the like. In a control condition, the weapons were replaced by badminton equipment, rackets, shuttlecocks, and so forth. There was also a control condition in which there were no objects of any sort in the room. So, some subjects received and delivered electrical shocks in the presence of weapons. Other subjects received and delivered electrical shocks in the presence of sporting goods, and others in the presence of nothing special at all. There was another minor variable in which the experimenter informed the subject that the objects in the room belonged to the Confederate, that they were his guns or his badminton equipment. Here are the results of the study. In a control condition where the subject got only a single shock, there wasn't much aggression, though you'll note that even here the subjects delivered more shocks to the Confederate than they received from the Confederate. And for that matter, when subjects received high levels of shock, they actually retaliated with less shock on average than they received. Remember, they received 7 shocks, and the overall average is about 5 shocks delivered to the Confederate. Still, the most important finding is that within the angry condition, retaliatory aggression reached its highest levels by subjects who were run in the presence of weapons, even when the experimenter made it clear that the weapons did not belong to the subject himself. Apparently, the mere presence of weapons in the room, a situational cue, was enough to increase the amount of aggression directed by the subject to the Confederate. This has come to be known as the weapons effect. In subsequent years, the weapons effect has stimulated considerable research on the effects of media portrayals of violence on aggressive behavior. It's well known, for example, that aggressiveness is significantly correlated with exposure to violence on TV, in the movies, and on video games. Now, whether the exposure causes the aggression, or whether the aggression causes the exposure, or whether they're both effects of a third causal variable, that remains a point of rather heated controversy. But the correlation between media violence and personal aggressiveness may turn out to be a real-world instance of the weapons effect. An extensive line of research on social influence was stimulated by the tragic case of Kitty Genovese, a woman who, according to the story, was brutally assaulted and murdered while a large number of her neighbors looked on without doing anything to help her. Actually, though, the popular story is something of an urban legend. Kitty Genovese was brutally assaulted and murdered, but it's not the case, as the legend has it, that 38 people witnessed the stabbing and did nothing. In fact, nobody actually saw the murder itself, and some people who heard the activity actually did try to help. Still, the overriding question addressed by this research was, what causes people to help when they help? We usually think of altruism as a personality trait, assuming that some people are more altruistic than others, and that altruistic people are more likely to render assistance in an emergency, even at some cost to themselves. But of course, features of the social situation may be important too, and it turns out that the presence of others can, under some circumstances, actually deter helping behavior. It was that discovery that made this research classic research in experimental social psychology. Darley and Latané recruited subjects for an experiment in which they were asked to complete some straightforward personality questionnaires. Some subjects completed the questionnaires alone in a small booth. Others completed the questionnaires in small groups. Now, in contrast to many of the experiments I've talked about so far in this lecture, none of the subjects in these experiments were Confederates of the experimenter. They were all real subjects, either completing the questionnaires alone or in a small group. In one version of the experiment, the subjects were left to complete their questionnaires, but midway through the session, non-toxic smoke began to filter into the room through a ventilation duct. In another version of the experiment, the subjects were informed that the experimenter would be working in the next room, and midway through the experiment, they heard a crashing, followed by the experimenter's cry that she had fallen and broken her foot. In both circumstances, whether it was smoke coming through a ventilator or somebody falling in the next room, that's an emergency. Someone needs to do something. The results of the study were striking. When the subjects were completing the questionnaires alone, more than 70% of them made some move to get help or render assistance. But when subjects worked in groups, their rate of helping behavior fell precipitously. In a later version of the experiment, when all the subjects but one were actually Confederates of the experimenter, and who assiduously ignored what was going on, helping was reduced still further. So in this case, the features of the social situation, whether there were others present and what they were doing, affected helping behavior. Now, the presence of other people doesn't always deter helping behavior. Here's another experiment that showed the effects of modeling on altruistic behavior. In one study, the experimenters positioned a female college student by the side of the road with a car with an obviously flat tire. A quarter-mile back, they had positioned another person, also with a flat tire, but also with another person, actually a confederate of the experimenters, who apparently had stopped to help. In another version of the experiment, the experimenters observed donations to a Salvation Army Christmas kettle. As people approached the Christmas kettle, the researchers arranged to have a confederate also approach the kettle and make a donation. So in the case of the first experiment, all the drivers on that road saw the college student with a flat tire, but half of them had also seen somebody model helping behavior. And in the second experiment, all the subjects showed the Salvation Army Christmas kettle, but again, half of them saw a model actually make a donation. The results of the study were clear. When the subjects were able to observe a model who was actually engaged in helping behavior, they were much more likely to help. When there was no model, they were less likely to help. So a feature of the social environment, whether there was a model for helping behavior, affected individuals' desire to help. There are lots of experiments like this in the literature of traditional social psychology, hundreds, thousands of such experiments demonstrating the social influences on behavior. A lot of this literature, like the Ash study, is on conformity, how the person responds to real or imagined social pressure. Now, one thing I need to make clear is that although Ash used a perception procedure to study conformity, it's not at all clear that conformity went down to the level of perception. It's entirely possible that the subjects knew which was the right answer, but simply conformed at the level of behavior to the judgments of the other people in the group. It's not at all clear, and Ash admitted this, that social pressure led the subjects to actually perceive the length of the lines differently. We're talking about social influences on behavior here, what they said they perceived. Now, in a conformity situation, everybody's of equal social status. In the Ash experiment, they were all college students. There's another literature on social influence, on what's known as obedience, or obedience to authority, where there is an unequal power relationship. And finally, there's a large literature on compliance, on what determines whether somebody is going to respond to an explicit request, like to sign a petition or give money toward a gift. In all these domains, we can see clearly the influence of the social situation. The presence of other people, what they say, what they do, has a tremendous impact on what the individual is going to do. The effect of the social environment on the individual's behavior is nicely captured by the psychosocial law proposed by Bibb Latané as part of his general theory of social impact. Latané is the same person who did those classic bystander intervention studies with John Darley. The psychosocial law is explicitly modeled after Stevens' law, which you'll remember from the lecture on psychophysics. Latané is interested in the magnitude of social influence, and he believes that there are three general determinants of the amount of social impact that impinges on an individual. First, there's the salience of the source of influence, by which Latané really means its status or power. Then there is immediacy, the closeness between the target and the source in space and time, and whether there are any barriers to social influence. And finally, there's number, the sheer number of sources of social influence that impinge on the individual. Latané's psychosocial law simply says that the amount of social influence that impinges on a person will be a function of the number of sources of social influences that there are in the environment. But it's not the sheer number of sources that's most important. Rather, there comes a point where there's kind of a law of diminishing returns. The first few sources are very important, and after that, adding additional sources doesn't really buy you very much. You'll remember from Ash's experiments on conformity that a unanimous majority of 3 or 4 exerted a fair amount of influence on the judgments made by individual subjects, but after that, adding more confederates up to 15 didn't really make much difference. In the same way that sensation grows more slowly than stimulation, social influence grows more slowly than the sheer number of sources of that influence. Now, so far, we've been talking about a lone target who is being influenced by a number of different sources. That's the situation we characterize as many-on-one social influence. But the targets of social influence aren't always alone. They may have allies. And if so, the total amount of social influence present in an environment is going to be diffused among all these allies of the target, as well as the target him or herself. Remember, again, from Ash's studies, that even a single dissenter among the group of confederates was enough to make the target's level of conformity drop almost down to 0. Now, I don't really want to make too much of this. I only want to use social impact theory and the psychosocial law as an example of how social psychology views the power of the environment to influence behavior, the power of features of the social situation to determine how individuals in that situation are going to behave. More recently, social psychologists have focused on another aspect of environmental influence, in what they call the automaticity of social behavior. You'll remember from our discussion of attention some time ago that cognitive psychologists make a distinction between 2 kinds of processes, automatic processes and controlled processes. Automatic processes have 4 characteristic features. First, inevitable evocation. An automatic process is inevitably evoked by the appearance in the environment of some specific stimulus. Once evoked, automatic processes run incorrigibly to completion. There's nothing you can do to stop them. They're executed efficiently in the sense that they require little or no cognitive resources. And because they require little or nothing by way of cognitive resources, they can be processed in parallel. You can do multiple things at once, so long as they're automatized. The concept of automaticity has been brought over from cognitive psychology into social psychology, and the feature of automatic processing that social psychologists have focused on mostly is the feature of inevitable evocation, that automatic processes are automatically set in motion by the appearance of some stimulus in the environment. And of course, that's exactly what the environmental influence on behavior is all about. The idea being that behavior occurs automatically and unconsciously in response to the appearance of some specific stimulus in the environment. The difference is that whereas most cognitive psychologists argue that some processes are automatic and others are controlled, and any particular task employs a mix of automatic and controlled processes, some social psychologists have argued that social behavior is overwhelmingly automatic in nature, and that conscious awareness and conscious control have very little to do with our actual behavior in the real world. Now, that's a very provocative claim, but a number of experiments do suggest that automaticity can play an important role in social behavior. In one experiment, John Barge and his colleagues brought subjects into the laboratory for a task on cognition. Their task was to unscramble scrambled sentences. He showed them a bunch of cards on which a number of words were printed, and then instructed the subjects to string the cards together so that the words would make a complete sentence. That was the cover task. For some subjects, the cards contained a lot of rude words, like aggressively and rude, bothered, disturbed, and intrude. For other subjects, the words they saw were related to politeness, words like respect and honor, considerate, appreciate, and patiently. A third control group saw words that had nothing to do with rudeness and nothing to do with politeness, words like exercising, flawlessly, occasionally, rapidly, and gleefully. After the subjects completed their task, They were instructed to step outside the experimental room and find the experimenter, which they did. And when they did so, they discovered that the experimenter was engaged in conversation with someone who was in fact a confederate of the experimenter. And for the next 10 minutes, the experimenter assiduously ignored the waiting subject, just didn't pay any attention to the subject at all. And the point of the experiment was to see whether the subject would actually interrupt the experimenter and say, "Hey, pay attention to me. I'm supposed to be doing something here." As it turns out, the subjects who unscrambled sentences containing lots of polite words behaved politely. Fewer than 20% of them actually interrupted the experimenter. They just waited there for 10 minutes until the experimenter was finished with his chat. That behavior was quite in contrast to the behavior of the subjects who had unscrambled sentences containing a lot of rude words. Here, they were highly likely to interrupt the experimenter. More than 60% of them did. And the subjects who worked on the neutral words were somewhere in between. So here's a feature of the situation, whether the subjects processed polite words or rude words that affected their behavior, whether they would interrupt the experimenter. Barge's interpretation is that reading all those polite words actually primed the subject to be polite, whereas reading all those rude words primed the subject to be rude. Now, of course, the experimenter was in fact being rude to the subjects, so it's possible that the subjects in the rude condition were primed not to behave rudely, but to perceive the experimenter as rude. But in either case, the idea here is that merely reading words relevant to politeness or rudeness led the subjects to behave in a polite or rude way, and that this influence was automatic in the technical sense that we've gotten from cognitive psychology. Automatic, unintended, and unconscious. And, as I say, Barge and others have promoted the view that most social behavior, maybe all social behavior, or almost all social behavior, is of just this sort. It occurs automatically as a response to the appearance of certain stimuli in the social situation. Most of our everyday life, he says, is not determined by our conscious intentions and deliberate choices, but rather by mental processes that are put into motion by features of the environment. This is the doctrine of situationism in almost pure form, capturing the influence of the environment on the behavior of the individual. Okay, so these were all illustrations about how features of the environment affect behavior that occurs within that situation. How about the reverse? How does behavior affect the environment? I'm going to have a lot more to say about this subject in the next lecture. But to begin with, if you think about it, all instrumental or operant behavior effectively changes the environment in which it occurs. That's what operant means. The organism, whether it's an animal or a person, operates on the environment, and that operation changes the environment in some way. Thorndike's cats, confined in the puzzle box, pressed a paddle and changed the environment from one in which the door was closed to one in which the door was open. Skinner's rats and pigeons, confined in the operant chamber, pecked at a key or pressed a bar and changed the environment from one in which there was no food in the hopper to one in which there was food in the hopper. Instrumental or operant behavior changes the environment in which it occurs. But now forget about cats and rats and pigeons and reflect on the fact that that's just always the case for us. Remember the doctrine of interactionism. The person is a part of the situation. You can't separate the person from the situation. So the person's behavior in that situation is going to change that situation. It's the very nature of behavior. You go to a party, you find it's kind of dull, you do something to liven it up. I don't know, you get up on a coffee table, put a lampshade on your head, and start dancing. Whatever it is you do. But that behavior changes the situation. It changes the situation for everybody in that situation. And similarly, the behavior of other people changes the situation in which you find yourself, because we're part of the situation. The situation is constantly in flux. It's dynamically changing as we and others in that situation engage in various kinds of behavior. Just to illustrate this point, let's go back to that classic Darley and Latané study on altruistic behavior, the helping experiment. There's smoke coming in through a ventilator shaft, or somebody has apparently fallen and broken her foot. The striking finding in this experiment, and in many other experiments of the same sort, is that the presence of other people actually deters helping behavior. People are much more likely to offer assistance when they're alone, or to seek assistance when they're alone, than they are when they're in a group. So why is that the case? Well, of course, it's complicated. Sometimes individuals don't help because they're afraid, or because they don't believe they have the required skills. But sometimes they don't help simply because they believe that someone else has already done so, or is about to. This is known as the diffusion of responsibility. If there are lots of people around, then it's possible somebody else has already noticed the smoke, or heard the experimenter's cry for help, and done something. So the individual doesn't have to do it. Now, diffusion of responsibility doesn't really work in this case because, remember, the subjects are sitting together in a room, in a group. So each of them knows that none of them has gone for help. Maybe somebody else has, but none of them have. So the diffusion of responsibility may be part of the answer. But it can't be the whole thing. The other factor, according to Darley and Latané, is what they call pluralistic ignorance. Many emergency situations are inherently ambiguous. That is, it's not entirely clear that they are emergencies. Two people fighting in a park might be roughhousing. They might even be rehearsing for a play or making a movie to post on YouTube. You don't know. When the situation is ambiguous, there's a tendency in all of us to refrain from acting until the ambiguity is resolved, until we can determine whether the situation really is an emergency and whether our help is really needed. We wait for the situation to be clarified, and frankly, that clarification usually comes from other people. As Ash demonstrated in his experiments on conformity, we tend to look to others for cues as to what to think and do, especially when the situation is ambiguous. The problem comes when everybody does this. If I'm trying to decide whether to help, and everybody else is doing the same thing, then nobody's helping. And this lack of action effectively defines the situation as either too dangerous, in which case I really shouldn't try to help, or not an emergency, in which case my help really isn't needed. This state, in which everybody looks elsewhere for cues as to what to believe, is known as pluralistic ignorance. It's a prime example of how the behavior that takes place in a situation, in this case, everybody doing nothing, creates a situation in which nothing can or need be done. So if you're a subject sitting with a group of people as smoke is pouring in through the ventilator shaft, the other's lack of action defines the situation as a non-emergency for you. And your lack of action helps define the situation as a non-emergency for the others. Of course, if the inaction of others shapes the situation, so does their actual action. And, as we observed in the modeling study, when people observe others helping, they themselves are more inclined to help. Evidently, in this case, the behavior of other people defines the situation as one in which helping is needed and possible and safe. So the experiments on altruism provide a dramatic example of how the behavior in a situation can change the situation. Other people's lack of action defines the action as a non-emergency. But if other people take action, that defines the situation as an emergency. We'll talk more about this next time when we talk about the various ways in which the person can influence his or her environment.